Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf. It's the daf for Shabbat. If you're new to learning with Hadran, so in general on Fridays we put up, actually on Thursdays we put up the daf for Shabbat usually, for sure the latest by Friday morning. You can always find it on the website. You look on if you look in today's daf, you can always get to, like on Thursday, you can always get to the next daf by saying next daf, and it'll already, if it's up, then it'll show you the Shabbat daf. Also on every page, where there's every daf page, you can always go to the calendar view and you can see there the Shabbat daf. And if it's clickable, then it means the daf is up and then you can find it there. And if you're listening through podcasts and YouTube, then you can always find it on Friday morning. It only goes up Friday morning on podcast and YouTube. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. So we were in the middle of a discussion from Daf Ham. We quoted a braita, and the braita was a little unclear. The braita darshan minabakar, to teach you that minabakar comes to tell you not a treifa. A treifa can't be brought as a korban. And then they went into some detail. They said, well, wouldn't you say it was a kal v'chomer? They don't eat a pasuk because you could learn it from a blemished animal. But blemished animal, which is permitted for a normal person to eat and yet is forbidden for the sacrifice, then wouldn't you say, obviously, then a treifa, which isn't even permitted for anyone to eat in general, all the more so for a sacrifice, it would be forbidden. To which they said, no, we're going to try to prove it from chaylev and dam, from the fats and the blood, which actually go on the altar and yet are forbidden to people. So what do you see? Things that are forbidden to other people sometimes are actually permitted. And then they said, oh no, but that's an exception. And they said, what about malika? And the way that we kill birds, and that's not a way that you can, that's the way that we slaughter them in the temple, but it's not the way we slaughter them in general. So again, they're not kosher to other people. They are for the altar. And then the Gemara said, fine, you can't prove from there. Each one had its own unique thing, reason why it's not. Then why we can't use that as a proof against. So then we're back to the kal v'chomer we could learn theoretically from blemished animal, to which the Gemara says, the braita said, im he shavta, but if you wanted to knock out that kal v'chomer, which was our big line that we can't figure out what it means, well, in the end we have a pasuk. So in other words, we have a kal v'chomer, but there could be some knockout of that kal v'chomer, which the braita doesn't mention, and that's what everybody tries to figure out, and that's why in the end we need a verse from the Torah. So now the Gemara is up to their fifth attempt to try to figure out what could be the pircha. So what we did in the first four was we took other cases. You could knock it out from kilayim, you could knock it out from Shabbat. Okay, we brought cases from outside the braita. The fifth attempt is Rav Sheisha b'reid Rav Idi, and he's going to do something similar to what the previous ones did, but actually from the braita itself. Let's look at the cases of the braita. There was chaylev and dam, and there was malika. Maybe we could do it from the combination of the two, the least common denominator. So Rav Sheisha b'reid Rav Idi Amar, we're starting from the very top of the daf. Mishum de'ikala meimar lehadr dina v'tete b'matzad. We can say, oh, you know what? Let's use the two of them together. Each one had a unique reason why it couldn't knock out the blemished animal on its own. But what we're going to say, it's a leniency, basically. And then you can't learn from there to our case. But you could maybe learn from our case and then knock out the kal v'chomer and come to the opposite conclusion if you put the two together. V'teti b'matzad, you could take the least common denominator between them. Mala malika sheken kedushata or tzata chaylev v'dam yochichu. So malika has this unique nature to it that it actually only becomes forbidden, some leniency to it. It only becomes forbidden when you designate it. And whereas treifa is going to be no matter what, and right even before you designated it, and chaylev v'dam yochichu. But chaylev and dam don't have that element. They're a problem from the beginning. They're forbidden from, they can't be eaten. Mal chaylev v'dam shkem ba'im michlal hatil, but chaylev and dam have their own leniency because they come from an animal. What the animal is actually permitted, whereas that's not true now for malika tochiach. Now that's not true for the bird. The bird, if you do malika outside the temple, is completely forbidden. And so chazara din lo rizeh kirizeh lo rizeh kirizeh. So what do we say? None of these are like each other, and therefore hatzada shavesh ben. What's the least common denominator? And each has leniency, but it's not in the other. So that proves that that's not exactly what's making it this law that it's going to be permitted legavoa. But atzana shavesh ben, the least common denominator, sha'asurin lehedyot mutarin legavoa. They're both in the end forbidden to everyone, but permitted on the altar. So what do you see? Afani avi treifa. So that would then reach the conclusion that we're looking for, which is, you would actually think that a treifa is also permitted to go on the altar. And that's why you need the pasuk. So here's a possible knockout to the kal vachomer. So even though it's permitted to a regular person, it should forbidden to a regular person, it still could be mutar to on the altar. However, the Gemara rejects this and says, just like they rejected all the others, but what about the common denominator that doesn't exist by treifa, which is that both malika and chelim and dam have to go on the altar. It's a mitzvah, it's a commandment to put them on the altar. That's very different than our case, a treifa, which there's no commandment to put on the altar. So just because that's permitted on the altar, that's because it's a mitzvah, those two, but not for treifa. So that didn't work. Now we're going to go with a sixth answer. But the sixth answer, first of all, is going to have a bunch of different parts to it, or I should say stages, because we're going to change each time something a little bit. But it's also taking a completely different approach. It's not going to say bring something from, something else to knock out the blemished, the kal vachomer about the blemished animal from some other case. But he's going to basically say maybe there's no real kal vachomer in the first place. Ela amar Rav Ashi, mishum de'ikal meimar, you could say, mi'ikar dedina pircha. From the get-go, from the very beginning, it was a bad argument. Mehecha kamaititele, where are you learning it from? Mi ba'almum, from a blemished animal. Now, ma'ala ba'almum, shekena savu maklivin keklivin. The whole idea was to make a kal vachomer and say the blemished animal is permitted for regular people to eat, but forbidden on the altar. So what do you see? Our case, which is forbidden to people to eat, should all the more so be forbidden on the altar because our case is more severe because it's forbidden to people. Now, what's the problem though? But blemished animals are much more severe. Why are they severe? Because they have this unique element that makrivin kikrivin. By the way, this and a whole bunch of other things we're going to see in today's daf, we also learned in Tzvachim, if you'll recall, that if you learn Tzvachim, that blemishes in general apply also to animals who are the kravim, the things being offered, and also the makrivim. Also the kohanim could be blemished. So it's something that's more severe because it actually appears also in humans as well, as opposed to the treifa, which is not, we don't eat people, so it's not an issue for humans. So Amalei Rav Achi Rav Ashi. So basically that's saying there's a stringency in ba'almum in the blemished animals, which basically then would say, you can't say kal vachomer, this is the lighter law, and yet it's severe, and there it's stringent. So therefore in the stringent law, we're going to also say we have the stringent law because this in and of itself has its own stringency, and maybe that's why it's forbidden to go on the altar, but we won't necessarily say the same thing for the treifa. So maybe the whole kal vachomer is wrong. But wait, that can't be the issue of makrivin kekrivin, can't be the issue because a yotzei dofen, who's an animal that says in the Torah, right, if it's not born by a natural birth, that will prove, because that case can't go on the altar, can be eaten by regular people, right? It has the same criteria as ba'almum, and it also can't be eaten. Well, it doesn't have that stringency. So what they're basically, in other words, saying is you could actually have just used the yotzei dofen then as a possible kal vachomer. So you can't knock out the ba'almum from that issue of makrivin kirkivin because you could have just instead substituted this case of yotzei dofen. So again, we'll say, that's permitted to a regular person, forbidden on the altar, all the more so the treifa. But they say, what do you mean? There's a stringency also by yotzei dofen. Mali yotzei dofen shkeneino kadosh bebechora. A bechor, a firstborn, if it's born not a natural birth, it's not even a bechor. So that's a stringency because it overrides kedusha. It basically prevents the kedusha of the firstborn, the sanctity of the firstborn, from applying to this animal. So if that's going to be the case for yotzei dofen, that's a stringency by a yotzei dofen, and that doesn't exist by a treifa. A treifa, if an animal is a firstborn, born as a treifa, or becomes a treifa, it's going to be sanctified anyway. So that basically must be some stringency by yotzei dofen. To which they say, what do you mean? Ba'almum yochiach. Well, maybe you could take the two together. Right? So we said the ba'almum can knock that out, but wait, the ba'almum also has makrivin kikrivim, yotzei dofen yochiach. In other words, each one has its own unique element. But again, if we put the two together, each one knocks it out because it's not the krivi makrivi ki krivim, and it's not the issue of eno kadosh b'bechora that creates this prohibition on the altar, because this one doesn't have that and this one doesn't have that. Back to lo yizeh kirizeh, right? Each v'lo yizeh, sorry, v'chazar hadin, right? And then we go back and we say lo yizeh kirizeh, that one cancels that, and lo yizeh kirizeh, that one cancels that. Hatzara shaveh shabem, what's the least common denominator? And now we're going to say we could have learned from the two of them together. Tzara shaveh shabem shemutarim lehedyot asurim legavoa v'kosh kein treifa shasura lehedyot asura legavoa. So from the combination of the two, we have two cases without any unique stringencies because each one has a different one. Knock out the two stringencies. We're left with a beautiful comparison, which brings us back to the beginning. And now it doesn't help us because we were trying to say we have a knockout for the kal v'chomer, and this is actually saying no, the kal v'chomer actually could work. So our attempts to knock it out that Rav Ashi brought don't seem to work. But we're going to say, wait, let's try this. Okay, ma lahatzad shaveh shebehen sheken lo hutru michlalan tomar b'treifa shehutra michlala. So they say, wait, let's come up with those two things actually have a stringency. Remember, as soon as they have a stringency, that means, that's going to break the kal v'chomer. What is their stringency? They're never permitted on the altar, whereas a treifa could be permitted in certain circumstances. We don't know yet what circumstances, because as far as we know, a treifa can't go on at all. So Amalei Rav Acha Berei Rav Rav Ashi. Treifa shu trami chlala maihi. So Rav Acha Berei Rav says to Rav Ashi, what are you talking about? What's a treifa shu trami chlala? If you're going to say malika de olat ha'of legavoa, if you're going to say, wait, when you do malika of the olat ha'of, right, the burnt offering of a bird, when you do malika, what does the kohen do? He takes his thumb, puts it on the back of the neck of the bird, perforates there something, and then from there he kills the bird. And when he perforates something in the back of the bird, the back of the neck, he actually makes the bird a treifa before he finishes the malika. So there you have a case of malika of the olat ha'of legava, where you're going to allow a treifa to go on the altar, because every time you do malika, you're basically making it a treifa the minute before you finish, or a few seconds or whatever it is before you finish the malika. So that would be a case where you actually can put a treifa on the altar. But the Gemara doesn't like this either. Balmum nami balfot ishtaruye ishtarei. But balmum, actually, we said, what's the difference? Balmum and a blemished animal and a non-natural birthed animal can never go on the altar. But the treifa sometimes can, like in a malika of a bird. But wait, a blemished animal can also go. If you're talking birds who are blemished can go, because remember, we've learned this before. But we learned that tamut u'scharut bebehema ve'ein tamut u'scharut. So, sorry, I should have read the line before again. Balmum nami ba'ofot ishtuye ishtre. Also, blemished animals are permitted in birds. So if you're already talking birds, well, then you can't say it's talking about that, malika, because blemished animals are also permitted on the altar, blemished birds. Okay, because tamut u'scharut bebehema ve'ein tamut u'scharut be'ofot. Okay, there's tamut is tmima, a perfection. You need perfection for animals, and you need in certain sacrifices like the ola, burnt offerings have to be only male. But when it comes to birds, they don't need to be perfect. They can be blemished, and they don't need to be male birds for the ola. So that doesn't work. Okay, within this answer, though, that we're going to try to now explain a different explanation of what does it mean hutar michlala. Let's find another case. Ela malika de chatat ha'of lekohanim. Maybe malika of chatat ha'of is permitted to kohanim to eat. Okay, not legavoa, because that we already said, well, blemished animals are also permitted legavoa. But there's a case where you can have a treifa that could be eaten, but yet you can't give a treifa of a sacrifice that could be eaten, whereas you don't have that by blemished animals. So they say, malika de chatat ha'of lekohanim, but no, that doesn't work, because kohanim is shulchan gavoa kazachu. No, that's also a case of it being legavoa. In other words, in the end, this is the same as the previous answer. What we're basically saying is, why do the kohanim, how do they get to eat the meat of the sacrifices, or in this case, the bird? Well, they're allowed to eat it because it's something that was given to God, and they get to get it because it was given to God. So that already makes it something that's permitted this malika case, where again it was a treifa before you finish malika. So the treifa is permitted to God, and through that the kohanim can eat. But that's no different than the previous answer, which we already said will soak and blemished birds also be offered to God. So this doesn't help us. Okay, now we're finally, after all this sugya, we're going to get to the real answer. And it's still within Rav Ashi, because again, Rav Ashi's approach was to say, we can just say the kaf chomer didn't work in the first place. Ela parichachi. And now we're going to say, again, it took us some time, but we got down to, we're doing blemished animals together with Yotzei Dofen. And we said the common denominator where we were going to try to learn this kaf chomer is that both are permitted to people to eat, but forbidden on the altar. So the treifa, which is forbidden to people to eat, obviously should be forbidden on the altar. But ela parichachi. Ma latzad hasheveh shebehen sheken muman nikal. Tomar betreifa sheken e muman nikal. Mishum hachi itzrich kra. That's why we need the pasuk. So what does this mean? Well, again, the two of them have a stringency. What's the stringency? That you can see their blemish. Blemish animal, usually you can notice the blemish. And a Yotzei Dofen, everybody saw it, or somebody saw it, was born improperly. Whereas a treifa, usually you can't even tell it's a treifa. It's usually something inside and the animal that you will sometimes only see after it's slaughtered. So because it's not noticeable, it's actually less severe. So maybe even though those can't be brought on the altar, maybe it's because they have this strict element about them that people can see them, and therefore it makes it worse to allow it on the altar. Whereas the treifa maybe could go on the altar because it's not noticeable. To which the Gemara says, right, Mishum hachi itzrich kra. That's why you need the pasuk in the end, because you could have knocked out the kal chomer in that way. And with that, we finish this long-winded sugya. Okay, but we're not completely finished. We have one more element to do before we get to the next Mishnah. And that's, until now, all we dealt with in this braita was that line, ve'im heshavta. Okay? If you're going to say this kal chomer doesn't work, and the braita left it open, and that left us in a quandary, how are we going to figure out how to understand that line? And we tried those 5 attempts before we finally got to Rav Ashi, tried a bit of a different approach. Instead of coming at it in one way, he came from a different way. We still had to go through a bunch of stages to get there, but we finally figured it out. And then, now we're going to focus on a different element in the braita. The braita said, in the end, where do they learn it from? Since they don't learn it from the kal chomer, which was the part we were focusing on, they learn it from mina bakar. Mina bakar, it was an extra word, because it already said it. So it comes to exclude a treifa. Well, the Gemara says, what are you talking about? Utreifa mehacha nafka. You think it comes from that pasuk? Mehatav nafka. We're now going to show there's 2 other psukim that exclude a treifa. So what are we doing with 3 psukim to exclude the same halacha? Mimashke Israel, as we saw in yesterday's daf. Mimashke Israel is this pasuk in Yechezkel, right? Secha menatzon, menamatayim, Mimashke Israel. Lemincha, laolah, lishlamim. It's talking about what you can use for korbanot, for sacrifices. And it says there, Mimashke Israel, from drinks that Jews, the Israelites drink. So from there we learn it's only things that are permitted to people to drink or eat that can actually go on the altar. So don't we learn it from there? And also another pasuk, Mikol asher ya'avol tachat hashavet. This is in Maser Behema. When you count that, you do the animal ties, you count 1, right? You count 1, 2, 3, 4 until you get to 10. You take the 10th, you keep counting every 10. Now, you have this staff, and every animal that goes by this under the staff, that you count. That's how it describes it. Now, what does that mean? The animals have to walk under the staff. Prat treifa she'eina overet. Treifa wouldn't count because a treifa can't walk because treifa's half dead. So you learn excludes a treifa. So the question is, what do we do with 3 psukim all teaching the same thing? Tzricha, you need them all. Why? De'imi mashke Yisrael, we're going to basically say each one wouldn't have been enough. That could just mean it has to be something that is kosher, let's say, could be eaten. But it might be saying only something that never could be eaten. Whereas a treifa was fine until it became a treifa. Okay? Dumia to orla v'kalei karim, like orla and kalei karim, that as soon as they grow, they're already problematic, right? Orla is the first 3 years of a tree, and kalei karim is when you crossbreed vines with grains. And as soon as they grow, they're forbidden. But maybe you could put something on the altar that at some point was kosher or was able to be eaten, wasn't forbidden to eat, and maybe that would work. And therefore, that's why we have the second pasuk to say, no. Anything that was a problem, even if it never was able to, even if it was at some point able to. If it can't right now, that's the kol asher yavor. If it could pass right now, right? But it could be saying, again, it's not so clear why that adds that, but it could just be adding an additional, even ones, right? You can't have a treifa even if it was at some point worthy. Now, if you just had that pasuk, in addition to the previous one, you would have said, that would come to exclude a case where it was a treifa, and then you sanctified it, because that's exactly the case with the animal tithe. What happens? You're taking the tithe now, you're about to sanctify. The animal's not sanctified yet, but it's already a treifa, and it can't even pass over, right? It can't pass by. Well, you can't sanctify it, because it was a treifa before you sanctified it. But, right, Jumia de Maser, just like Maser. But if you designated it, and then it became a treifa, well, then you might say, look, I designated it was totally fine. Maybe I could put it on the altar. So what if it became a treifa now? Ematit kasher, you might have thought it would be good. Kata rachmana mina bakar. Therefore, the Torah said mina bakar to exclude even that case. If it was a treifa after you designated it, it still can't go on the altar. As long as before you put it on the altar, it's a treifa, it's a problem. And sriche. That's why you need all three psukim. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next Mishnah. New topic. Echad minchat chotei. Ve'echad kol menachot. Okay, it's a little strange language, and the Gemara is going to immediately jump on this. We start the Gemara, which is the mincha of a sinner, right? The olav yored one, we've talked about the sliding scale, and any mincha. Okay, why didn't it just say all the minchas, which include the minchat chotei as well? So we'll get back to that. Shekamatzan, that if the kmitza was done by a zar, a non-kohen, or an onen, or a person who just lost a close relative, right, the first day. Tful yom, someone who, right, we actually had a whole discussion, first day or maybe first day, second day until the burial. Tvul yom, someone who's impure, went to the mikveh but is still waiting for the sun to go down before they can be pure. Mechusar begadim, missing clothes, meaning not wearing the clothes of the kohen. Mechusar kippurim, it's a kohen, let's say, who was going through a purification process, had to bring sacrifices on the 8th day, right? They were pure on day 7, let's say a zav. Has to bring sacrifices on the 8th day, hasn't yet brought them, can't do the kmitza. All of these are disqualified from doing kmitza. The Kohen didn't wash his hands before. Arel, he was not circumcised. Tameh, he was impure. Yoshev, he was sitting down. Omer al gabe kelim, he was, right, because you have to stand. Omer al gabe kelim, al gabe behema, al gabe ragle chavero. These are 3 different situations where if you're standing on something, you have to not only stand, but you have to be standing with your feet on the floor. If there's a separator between the feet and the floor called a chatzitza, like you have in a mikveh. If there's a separator, like you're standing on a vessel, you're standing on an animal, you're standing on the feet of your friend, no good. Okay? Pasul. So all these cases are disqualified. In addition, they list one more case. Kamatz bismol, pasul. If you did the kmitza with your left hand, it's pasul because Kohen has to do it with their right hand. Okay. Comes ben betera. Ben betera omil. Yachzil v'yachzor v'yikmotz b'yamin. If you did it with the left, and it sounds like he's only disagreeing about that case, although we're going to understand him differently when we get to the Gemara. But right now, assume it's talking about only the left, and that's maybe why they separated that case from all the rest, had its own list. If you did that, you took the kmitza out. Remember, the Kohen takes a handful, takes it out, puts it in a sanctified vessel. Well, if you took it out, comes Ben B'Teri and he says, if you did it with your left hand, yachzir v'yachzol v'yikmotz b'yamin, you should just do it again. In other words, put it back in the dough, mix it back into the batch, do your kmitza again. Okay, that's what he says. Kamatz v'alav yadot tzror. Okay, now the Mishnah moves to a different halacha. Kamatz v'alav yadot tzror o gargar melach o koret shelavona pasul. If while you put your fingers in to get out the handful, the Kohen does it, and in his hand, in addition to the dough, is a pebble or a grain of salt or frankincense. Okay, what do? Well, it's disqualified. Why is it disqualified? If you take any more than any less, it has to be an exact, precise handful. If you take any more, any less, now in this case you're taking less because it's mixed in with something else. There's something else that's taking up space. What's a yatel? If you took a handful with a extra, you kind of took a heaping handful. You just use the tip of your fingers to go in there and take dough. Then you didn't use, right? You have to extend your fingers out to reach kind of the bottom of your palm, and then right the bottom of your hand, and then you get a full one. But if you get less, then that's chaser. But also this case is chaser. So now the Gemara starts with our first question that I mentioned, which is Why does it specifically say amin chachote or all the menachot? It should be just all the menachot. Litni kol menachot shekmatzan zal ve'onen, etc. It should have just said all menachot, which would have included the chote. To which the answer, the Rabbi Shimon Itzrich. This was needed for Rabbi Shimon. Why? Titania amar Rabbi Shimon. Shimon has this interesting halacha. Rabbi Shimon says, see this also on Daf Tevav, B'dinu shetei mincha chote tuna shemen ulevona. Okay, I mentioned many of the meal offerings have oil and frankincense with them. So the mincha chote should have had one as well. Why? Should have had both because shelo yehei chote niskar. Because what, we're going to reward you? You're bringing a mincha as a sinner. You did something wrong. We're going to actually make you bring less than a regular person who wants to bring a voluntary mincha. That seems weird. So if you want to bring a voluntary, you have to bring it with everything. You sinned, and now you have to bring one. We're going to let you do less. You're getting rewarded for your sin. So then why doesn't it need? Because it actually doesn't need oil and frankincense. So it seems like, right, it should. Well, shelo yehei korbanon mehudal. So Rabbi Shimon says, we don't want you to have a beautiful sacrifice. You're a sinner. Have a plain sacrifice. Shouldn't bring something beautiful. Doesn't make sense. Okay? Right? We don't want a nice mincha. So now they say, ubedinhu, well then, why don't we apply the same thing to, this is Rabbi Shimon's opinion, why don't we apply the same thing to sin offerings, to the animal offerings? Bedinhu shtei chatat chelev tunan esachim. Now, theoretically, if you ate chelev and now you have to bring a sin offering because you ate accidentally, unwittingly, you ate forbidden fats, and now you have to bring a chatat. Theoretically, you should have to bring libations with it, just like an ola and a shlamim. They come with libations and mincha offerings that go with them. And you should have had to bring them, in theory, as turning out amabet, shelo yehei chote niskal. So again, so you won't be rewarded. Umipnei ma'ina tuna, so why don't you need it? Shelo yehei korbanon mehudal, but same thing. We don't want you having this nice korban, so we don't bring the extra things with it. We keep it simple. Okay, so they're going to say, okay, so same thing by mincha, same thing by sacrifices. So now what does this have to do with us? Why does it have to say in our Mishnah? All, right, not only all chatats, also the sin offering. Well, because it wants you to know, sakdat hachamina, you might have thought, because Rabbi Shimon said we don't want the sinner's offering to be nice. Maybe then, maybe if a disqualified person does it, or it's done in a disqualified way, maybe we don't care, because that's all part of the beautification of the korban. It's to be done by the right person. They have to be wearing the right clothes. They have to do it in the right way. But if it's a korban that we don't really care about, that doesn't need to be beautiful, maybe it's okay. So this Mishnah is telling you, we have to specify. Also, sin minchas. Okay, mincha offerings for sins, also it's disqualified. According to Rabbi Shimon, even according to Rabbi Shimon. To which the Gemara says, okay, wait a minute. So we've just established that Rabbi Shimon holds this both in minchas and in sacrifices, animal sacrifices. Well, then if we go back to Zvachim, you probably don't remember all this, but if we look at the parallel Mishnah in Zvachim, what would you expect it to say? You'd expect it to say sin offerings, chatats, and all other offerings that are brought in the wrong way, right? But it's not what it says. It should also there say echad chatat chelev, echad kol hazvachim, shekiblu damam zera v'onen, etc. Belema, and then we'd say Rabbi Shimon Itzrich, and then we'd say the same thing. This was all telling you, even according to Rabbi Shimon, it's disqualified. Alma kevan detane le kol v'lo katane chutz kulu mashma, right? And again, we would say, you would say then, since it says all, and it doesn't say except for, kulu mashma, right? And then you'd say, well, hachanami kevan detane kol v'lo katane chutz kulu mashma. So now we're going to say, right, why is it needed by us? If it wasn't needed there, right, then why was it needed, right? So just like there, they just said kol, and they didn't say chutz, even though you would have thought you needed it. Why don't we have the same thing by us? So something doesn't make sense here. To which they say, no, it does make sense. Why? Itzrich, you need it here specifically. Why? Sal kadat hachamina, because here you would have thought to say, ho il v'ukimna l'reisha de lo Rabbi Shimon. Go back to the beginning of the Masechet. What did we say? Rabbi Shimon doesn't match our Mishnah. Remember, we had one way to explain maybe he does, according to Rav Ashi, but according to Rabbah and Rabbah, it completely disagrees with the Mishnah. The Mishnah says if you do it shalom lishma, then it's valid, but it doesn't work for the owner. And Rabbi Shimon says it's valid and it works for the owner. So if you're going to say that, then we already said the Reisha is not like Rabbi Shimon, which means that you probably assume that this Mishnah is also not like Rabbi Shimon. Seifa nami de lo ka Rabbi Shimon, which means what? If our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Shimon and it just said all mincha offerings, then you would think, oh, this must not be Rabbi Shimon, and he must say when it comes to the sin offering, the sin mincha, the minchat choteh, the mincha for the sinner, he probably would disagree and he would say, oh yeah, it would be fine. Kamash malan. That's what they had to tell you. No, by adding the word for the words choteh, the sinner, the minchat choteh, that teaches you why are we adding it. There's no reason to add it according to the rabbis. The only reason would be to add it according to Rabbi Shimon. And we're saying, don't think that Rabbi Shimon doesn't disqualify. He disqualifies them as well. He thinks they're problematic. Okay, even though he has this idea that the korban doesn't need to be beautiful. And you didn't need that in Zvachim because there was no reason to think in Zvachim it wasn't like Rabbi Shimon. Here we have reason to think it wasn't Rabbi Shimon, and therefore they wanted you to know, no, this Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon as well. He would agree that it's still disqualified, even though you might have thought not. Okay, that was the first thing we did with this Mishnah. The second thing is going to be Rav. I'm a Rav. Rav says the following halacha. Now we have to fit this in with our Mishnah. Zal shekamatz yachzir. If a non-Kohen does the kmitza, you just put it back in, and then presumably, right, you do it again. You put the komets back into the batch, and then you have a Kohen do it. Okay, wait a minute. We're assuming at first that Rav must hold like the rabbis in the Mishnah, but Hanan Tnan, Anam Pasal Tnan. But the Mishnah says all those cases are disqualified. How can you just put it back in if it's disqualified? So they say, what do you mean, my Pasal? Pasal ad shiachzir. It's disqualified temporarily till you fix it. That's the way Rav reads the Mishnah. The rabbis are saying it's disqualified until you fix it. And that makes no sense to read the Mishnah like that because what do we see in the Mishnah? There's a machloket between the rabbis, or Tanakama, first Tana, and Ben Betera. Well, then Ben Betera agrees with the rabbis. The rabbis basically say it's disqualified until you fix it. Ben Betera comes and says, well, you can fix it. Right? Put it back in and fix it. But that's what the rabbis say. So they say, nah, you can explain it like this. Okay? There's going to be two tracks. Either you did it wrong, in both cases you did it wrong, and then you lost part of it, or you did it wrong and you still have the whole thing. So we're going to go like this. We're going to start with the second case. First that I mentioned, if the piece is still there and you have it in its entirety, they agree with Ben Betera. You could just put it back. And that's what Rav is saying. Their argument is the chaser komets. What if you lost some of the komets after that? Some of it fell on the floor and got ruined. Someone stepped on it, or it got lost. Rabbanan savre lo yavi mitoch beitov yimalena. You can't fill it back in that dough you originally had to get back to the same size and redo it. You have to start from scratch. Ben Betera savre yavi mitoch beitov yimalena. Ben Betera says, go home, bring some more dough, some more fine flour, add it to there, add the more ingredients, fill it back in, and do it again. Okay, that's very nice. Sounds nice in theory, but it doesn't match at all the wording of the Mishnah. Because ihachi, what does it say in the Mishnah? Ben Betera, right? If so, Ben Betera says, look at the words. Yachzir v'yachzor v'yikmos b'yamin. Just put it back in and go and do the kmitza a second time with the right hand. But it should have said, if that's what it meant, if the machloka was all about, can you go home and refill it? Should have said that in the Mishnah. Ben Betera omel, yachzir v'yavi mitoch beito v'yamalena v'yachzor v'yikmos b'yamin mibayle. Should have said, go back home, fill in more, and then go do it again, if that's his real machloka. So this whole attempt to try to fit Rav into the rabbi's position and change what the rabbi said, which then changes what Ben Betera says, doesn't really work. So Kika Amar Rav le Ben Betera. So now we're saying, okay, Rav just agrees with Ben Betera. To which the Gemara says, Pshita. Okay, wait. That's very clear. And Rav is saying something as if he's making up something new, right? He's telling us a new halacha. But he's basically telling us what Ben Betera says, which is you can fix things. Now, it's true that Ben Betera said only you can fix yamin, and Rav seems to be saying you can fix anything. But we're basically going to say that that's what Ben Betera holds, that you can really fix anything, even though he just said yamin. And we're going to say like this, right? Why is it not obvious? Because that's exactly what Rav is doing. He's telling us, Ma'u detema ad kan lo kamachshir Ben Betera ela bismol. You might have thought, because Ben Betera was talking about left, maybe he only permits left to be fixed if you did it with your left hand. Aval b'shar psulim lo, but maybe he doesn't allow anything else. So kamash malan, that's why Rav came to say, oh no, I hold like Ben Betera, and in fact, don't get confused. Don't think Ben Betera just meant you could fix it. It was done with the left hand. He actually holds you could fix everything. And that's what Rav is coming to teach us. So we're going to have a few questions on this. The first question is, why would we think that of all the disqualifications, only the left hand Rav Ben Betera would have permitted? And we're asking about what you would have thought, not what it actually is, because it actually is all the same according to this. But why is it any different? Well, the echshalan hechshera miyom kippurim. It's the only of disqualification you can actually do at some point. What is that? On Yom Kippur, you're allowed to do avoda with your left hand. Who does it? The Kohen Gadol, very famous. When he goes into the Kodesh Kodeshim, he has to take two things with him. He has to take a pan full of coals, and he has to take the incense. So he has the pan full of coals in his right hand, because that's much heavier. And then he has a spoon full of incense. Now, he can't really put it under his right arm because it'll spill, right? Try to carry a spoon like that, right? You think of all those egg games, like with the spoon in your hand and trying to balance the egg, right? It's very hard. So he puts it in his left hand. So there you have a case where avoda, that's obviously avoda, bringing it into the Kodesh Kodeshim, and it's permitted with the left hand. But there's another avoda that also we permit one of these psulim, and what's that? And then you would say, oh, well, small is not unique. And then we're back to why did we think that only small could be fixed? Because zar nami eshkachan lehechshera b'shchita. A zal, there's a heter in shrita, because a shrita can be done by a zar, slaughtering a different animal. So they say, oh no, that's not an avoda that can be done in some disqualified way where there is a case where it's permitted, because shrita lav avoda. We don't call shrita avoda. This is a whole sugya we also had in Zvachim. And you call shrita an avoda. Now, it is one of the four main avodot, but it's not really called an avodah for the purposes of kehuna. And we're going to see that right now. So the fact that we permit a zar to do it isn't really, oh, wow, we permit a zar to do it. No, it's just not an avodah. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, is it really? And now we're going to have a parenthetical sugya where we're going to say maybe shrita is avodah. But then we're going to reject that. Okay, so we're leaving this for a minute and just saying, who's to say shchita is not avoda? Velo, it's not. V'hamar Rabbi Amarav. Shchitat para, we're talking about the para aduma. When you slaughter the red heifer, bizar psula, it's disqualified by a non-Kohen. So what do you, V'amar Rav Allah, and Rav explained on that. Elazar v'chukah k'tiva, because it says Elazar in the pasuk, who was the Kohen, and it says chukah, there you learn it has to be a Kohen. So what do you see here? It must be the slaughtering, at least right, of a red heifer. And if they're a red heifer, obviously all sacrifices would be an avodah, because it needs guna. And then we have this extra time where we say, oh, but shechita for an animal, for a sacrifice, well, it's permitted for a zar. So then zar is no different than left. And then why only left? Well, they say, no. Shani parat, koche bedekabayiti. That's in a whole different category. It's not for the altar. It comes in, right, things in the temple are either under maintenance or mizbeach. If they're not mizbeach, they're called bedekabai. It's not really maintenance, but it's not a sacrifice. So then they say, well, ironically, that should be the reverse then, right? And then they say velav kol dekenu. Wouldn't it be an obvious then inference that if kodshe bedekabai ba'u kahuna, that if things that are less important need kahuna, the slaughtering of them, kodshe mizbeach lo ba'u kahuna, right? But something for the altar wouldn't need Kohen. That makes no sense to say that. So Rav Sheisha braita Rav Edis, and then understand it like this. Midi to have a marot nigain. This is really like you need a Kohen. The reason you need a Kohen for slaughtering a paraduma has nothing to do with whether slaughtering is an avoda or not. Because if it was an avoda, then you would definitely need it. If you needed it for bedekabayit, you would definitely need it when you did it in the altar for regular sacrifices. But what's the reason it needs kuna? Well, it's more like we have a paradigm for it somewhere else where we do this, which is who gets to check whether you have a leprous mark or not. Only a Kohen. To lav avoda ninu, it's not called avoda, the checking, is it leprous mark or not, ubai kuna, and yet it needs kuna. So there you have it, that this clearly isn't avoda. It's just a unique halacha. The Torah tells you this action needs to be done by a Kohen, but it's not called an avoda. And we're back to saying shlita is not avoda, and then we're perfect. We have an explanation of small why left is different. But now they say, what do you mean? What about zar also kasher b'bama? Okay, v'nelef mi bama. Why don't we learn it from the bamot? Where zar is allowed to, going back to the end of Zvachim, zar can do the worship in a private altar. So in the time when private altars were permitted, right? There were only certain times when there was no central temple or tabernacle. Now you might say we don't learn from bamot, but we do, because look, Vahatanya, right? Because that was a time where actually it was permitted. So that's why a Zar could do it, but we can't learn to regular times when Zar is not allowed to do it. So, Vahatanya, minayin liyotze, shimala lo yired. How do you know that if something left the Azara walls, that if you then put it on the altar, even though it's disqualified, we actually leave it on the altar? Sharei yotze, this is we saw a few times in Zvachim, Sharei yotze kasher bebama, because there's no sanctity of space in a private altar, and that makes yotze, the whole disqualification of it, not so significant. So it's weaker. So from that, we're going to say, so if it went on the altar already, we can leave it. Now, what do you see here? We learn from Bamot. But you might remember the end of that sugya. In the end, they say, you can't learn from Bamot to a regular case. Tana azot Torah ha'olah samechle. In the end, they really learn the halacha from somewhere else. We learn it from a drasha in the pasuk. This is the rules for an olah. Anything that goes up on the altar actually stays on the altar, presuming certain criteria. But that's why something that went out can. It's not really learned from Bama. In the end, we tried to learn from Bama also. They say, no. Can't learn it from the Zara and the Bama. So we're left with, really, it's just the reason why they thought small, because small is the only case where things are actually permitted. And even though we tried to say a Zar can do shchita, that's not an avoda. We tried to do a Zar can do the avoda in Bamot, but we can't learn from Bamot to regular times. So that explained why we thought, and Rav had to tell us, no, don't think it's only small, even all the other disqualifications can be fixed. Well, now the Gemara says, okay, Elatama de Eshmin and Rav. So this is all because Rav told us. Otherwise, we would have thought it was small, right? That's what we're up to. We would have thought just Ben B'Tera said it in the left. Rav is the big innovator who told us that's the case. Remember, he's first generation Amora. Okay. But halav hachi, so without that, according to what you're saying, hava amina b'shar psulim pasal Ben B'Tera. We would have thought Ben B'Tera disqualified everything else, and that's why Rav is telling us this. But that can't possibly be true, because look at this. Vahatanya, there's a braita that predated Rav that says Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon Omri, Machshir Ben B'Tera b'chol psulim kulam. Okay, so these Tanaim said Ben B'Tera permitted completely. Okay, all disqualifications. He said you can fix them all, basically. He didn't permit them. He just said go put it back in the batch and do it again. And furthermore, Vitanya, V'kamatz misham. Okay, here's the first drasha is not relevant. It's just to lead to the second. There's two different drashot on the words V'kamatz misham. The pasuk is you bring the meal offering to the kohen, and the kohen does the kmitza right there. So the first drasha is, what does that mean? Mimakom sheraglei azar omdot. You can even do kmitza in the first 11 cubits of walking into the azara, which is where Yisraelim are allowed to go. And meaning you don't have to do it in Safon, because according to some opinions, what's Safon? So Safon is where you do all the kochim, the slaughtering. You might have thought Kmitza, which is parallel to that, and Minchas or kochim, you might have to do it in the north. You don't have to do it in the north, because the north is opposite the altar. And opposite the altar, again, according to some opinions, there's a whole debate what north is. But if you say it's opposite the altar, that's much further in the room, not where a Zar can go. Ben B'Tera Omer, Minayin she'im kamatz b'smol, she'yachzir v'yachzor v'yikmotz b'yamin, Tamalamar v'kamatz misham, mimakom shekamatz kfar. Now we're going to see Ben B'Tera gets his proof about the small issue, about that you can redo it. From here, it says v'kamatz misham. Well, what's the misham? He doesn't understand it the first way. He says it means from the place where you once did it already, meaning you can redo it. Now, notice that pasuk. Now, it's true he said small, but kevan dekras stomach tivba mali small mali sharp psulim. But that pasuk isn't really specifically unique to left. It sounds like any kind of disqualification. So we have two sources that basically seem to indicate. Who's to say Ben B'Tera, you would have thought it was only left, and Rav had to come tell us this? Doesn't make any sense. Rav was really trying to teach us kamatz va'afilu kidesh. He wanted to teach us a different halacha. When he said kamatz yachzir, kamatz yachzir, he means even if he did the kmitza, and even if he went so far as to also put it in the klei sharet, which is what you do with the kometz after the kohen takes it, then he puts it in a new vessel, sanctified vessel. Even once it went into the sanctified vessel, you could still fix it. Okay? Ulafuke, and he wanted to say, this is what Rav is teaching us, mehani tonight. Say, I don't agree with these Tanaim. Titania, as it appears in the braita, Yossi ben Yasim for Rabbi Yehuda Nachtom Amru, these two rabbis said, two Tanaim, Bamid Dvarim Amurim. When does Ben B'Tera say this? Shekamatz v'lo kidesh. Aval kidesh pasal. They said only if you did the kmitza, but you didn't put it in the sanctified vessel. If you already put it in the sanctified vessel, too late. Ben B'Tera doesn't think you fix it, and he wanted to say, no, that's not true. And Rav was trying to say, I disagree with those Tanaim and the way they understood Ben B'Tera. Now, some people say that Rav was actually saying the opposite, because look at Rav's words. He doesn't say anything about Kidesh. All he says is Zar Shekamatz Pasul. So some people say he's trying to say, I support those Tanaim. Ika de Amre, some people say, Kamatz in Kidesh Lo. Kiman Kehane Tanai Lafu Kimitana Kama. That he basically said, oh no, I mean only if you did the Kmitza Ben B'Tera permits. And if you actually put it in the vessel already, it's too late. And he says, I hold like those Tanaim, and I disagree with the Tanakama there, who disagrees with those Tanaim and thinks even once you put it in the vessel, Ben B'Tera said you can fix it. So we have two opposite ways of understanding what Rav was trying to say here. Was he trying to say one thing or the opposite? Matkefla Rav Nachman. My kasavre hane tanai. So now Rav Nachman says, wait a minute, what do you think these Tanaim hold? I kmitza psulin avodahi, afagav delo avidle matan kli. So if psulin, right, if the kmitza of psulin is considered an avoda, even if you did it, right, afagav delo avidle matan kli, even if you didn't put it in a vessel, it should be a problem. And I kmitza psulin lav avodahi, and if you say, okay, if they did it and we view this as an avoda, it's a disqualified avoda. So what's the difference if we put it in a vessel or not? Just that doing the kmitza should be a problem. And if it's not avoda, well, then it's as if they did nothing. Ki avalei matan kli, even if they put in a kli, my have, it's also nothing. So we're going to have to figure this out. We're going to leave you with this question and we'll answer that tomorrow. Okay, so let's just review our daf. We started with the fifth explanation of what this attack on what possible thing you could do to attack that kal vachomer or undo it. And right, Rav Sheisha brings a fifth answer, trying to learn it from the two cases that were in the braita together and the common denominator between them, but that didn't work. Then we went to Rav Ashi, who basically said, oh, the kal vachomer from the first place made no sense. And then we tried to figure out what exactly about it didn't make sense till we finally narrowed it down to what he actually says. And it ends up saying, really, they add to the mission, it's a blemished animal and a yotze dofen together. And the two of them have a unique stringency that doesn't exist by the treifa, which is muman nikar. Okay, you can see their blemish, and that's why they're more severe, and that would be a way to knock it out. That's why we need the pasuk. And then we said, wait, if we need the pasuk, but there's two other pasukim, why do we need all of them? And then we explained. Then we moved on to the Menachot and all the other Menachot that are done by someone who's disqualified. So they're all just right. It's disqualified basically, or if it's done in a way that disqualifies it, Ben B'Tera says you can actually fix it. And then we went into two basic things. One was, why do we had to say Minchat Kote also? And that was to say, even according to Rabbi Shimon, who has this whole idea that a korban shouldn't look beautiful, for a Chote, still he would say that it can't be done in a disqualified manner. And then we compared to Zvachim. Why in Zvachim didn't we need that? And that's all because of the structure of our Mishnayot in this chapter. Basically the first Mishnah, which isn't Rabbi Shimon, but this they wanted to tell you is. And then Rav says this halacha, Zar shekamatz yachzir. And then we said, first we thought he held with the rabbis, then we said, no, he clearly holds it Ben B'Tera. And what's he adding then? Oh, he's adding it's not just left. And then we had to say, why do we think just left? And then we had to say, what's he adding and what's he trying to tell us that no one else said before him? And then, people did say it, but he was telling us he sides with either one side or the other, which we had two different readings, whether it's only if you did the kmitza or even if you did the kmitza and put it in a vessel, you're still able to redo it. And with that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone Shabbat Shalom.